This property is under demolition order. You're all trespassing.
Have you ever faced a choice that could change everything? Not just for you, but for an entire community you didn't even know you were a part of. A choice where your head and your heart are screaming in opposite directions. Most of us have on some level. But for Elias Vance, a tech mogul whose net worth eclipses the GDP of several small nations, that choice wasn't just a fork in the road. It was a seismic event. Picture this. Elias, a man who turned ruthlessness into an algorithm and efficiency into his religion. His world is one of glass and steel boardrooms in Silicon Valley, of cold, hard code, of multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. Emotion, to him, is a bug in the system, a variable to be eliminated. He came to Port Blossom, Oregon, not to find peace. He came to demolish it. His target, the dilapidated old fish cannery, a rusted-out scar on the coastline, to be leveled for a massive, efficient, and soulless data center. To him, this was just another transaction, an end to the obsolete and the beginning of a future he controlled. But fate has a twisted sense of humor. And then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the wind whistling through the rotted roofs. Not the distant crash of the waves. It was a whisper, a rustle of small fingers, performing an extraordinary task. When Elias pushed open the corroded door and stepped into the main warehouse, his world of numbers and logic shattered. There, amid the decay and the shadows, beneath a steel beam that could give way at any moment, were two children. Clara, 11, with the eyes of a seasoned warrior, and Rosie, 7, whose innocence hadn't yet been snuffed out by a harsh world. They weren't playing. They were mending colossal fishing nets, a job that would make grown men flinch. This isn't a video about the rich versus the poor. This isn't a simple fairy tale. This is a collision course. On one side, the absolute power of money and technology, a force bent on erasing the past. On the other, the unbelievable resilience of two children, trying to patch not just a set of nets, but the last shred of a town's soul and the legacy of a hero father they had lost. In today's video, we won't just tell you a story. We will take an emotional journey to the very edge, to witness how a single bedside promise can alter the destiny of an entire town. We'll explore whether a heart, frozen by success and loss, can learn to thaw from the hands of people with nothing to offer but love and memory. Stay with me, because what happens next is a powerful lesson in the true cost of a legacy and the power of finding family in the most unexpected of places. Silence filled the vast space, thicker and heavier than decades of dust. For the first time in his illustrious career, Elias Vance felt he had lost the upper hand. He was used to walking into a room and instantly becoming the center of gravity, where all eyes turned to him, where his voice was command. But here, in this kingdom of decay, he was just an intruder, and the eyes of the older girl, Clara, held no fear. They held a quiet defiance, a resolve forged by burdens Elias couldn't even imagine. He cleared his throat, trying to reclaim his usual authority. His voice rang out, sharp and out of place in the stillness. "What are you girls doing here? This place is condemned. It's not safe. Where are your parents?" Clara didn't take her eyes off him, her small hands still gripping the thick needle and twine. "We're working," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "And we don't have a father. Our mother is sick." The blunt answer made Elias pause. The logic in his head began to run its usual course. Minors, unsupervised, in a hazardous area. This was a legal nightmare. A problem to be solved, quickly, cleanly, decisively. He pulled out his expensive leather wallet, its sound echoing luxuriously in the squalid space. He took out 5 crisp $100 bills, a sum he assumed could solve most problems in a town like Port Blossom. "Take it," he said, his tone slightly less harsh, as if speaking to minor shareholders. "This is $500, enough for you to buy whatever uniforms or school supplies you need. Take it, go home, and never come back here again. Understood?" He held out the money, expecting to see a glimmer in the eyes of impoverished children. But Clara just looked at the bills, then looked directly back into his eyes. "We don't need your money," she said plainly, "and we can't leave. This work, it's more important than money." Annoyance began to rise in Elias. He wasn't used to being rejected, especially when he was offering what he considered to be an incredibly generous solution. "More important than money. Don't be ridiculous, child. This is just a pile of torn nets in a warehouse that's about to be demolished. Nothing here is important." "You're wrong," Clara said, standing up, her small frame radiating an unbelievable strength. "This isn't a pile of torn nets. This is my father's legacy. Mateo Reyes. He promised he would mend them for this year's blessing of the fleet, before the sea took him. Now it's our job. Our father's promise is our promise." The younger girl, Rosie, who had been silent until now, looked up at Elias with teary eyes. "Daddy Mateo promised," she whispered, and that simple sentence was like a needle piercing Elias's iron heart. Legacy. Promise. Abstract concepts, worthless on his balance sheet. He came here to deal with assets and liabilities, but was dragged into a story of oaths and memories. He felt a strange feeling creeping in. Confusion. He could negotiate a billion-dollar contract, could predict market trends with terrifying accuracy, but he had absolutely no idea what to do with an 11-year-old girl talking about the spirit of her dead father. He looked around the factory again. This time he didn't just see decay and financial loss. He saw a stage where a family tragedy was quietly playing out. He felt uncomfortable. He wanted to return to his world where everything could be priced, bought, and sold. Elias let out a long sigh, his patience worn thin. He put his wallet away, the coldness returning to his eyes. "I don't care about your promise," he lied, though even he felt his words were a bit hollow. "I only care about the truth. And the truth is, in 3 weeks, the demolition crew will be here. This entire place will be nothing but a pile of dust. Enjoy your legacy while you can." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the 2 children with their nets and their unfinished promise. He had left the factory, but the image of Clara's defiant eyes and her words, "my father's legacy," had not. It had begun to take root in his mind, like a stubborn vine, creeping through the very walls he had spent a lifetime building. The car rolled away from the fishing docks, leaving behind the smell of salt, oil, and decay. Elias returned to the temporary penthouse he was renting at the town's only luxury hotel, a glass and steel tower that looked completely out of place among Port Blossom's weathered wooden roofs. He tried to push the image of the 2 children out of his head. He opened his laptop, trying to focus on the growth charts of a subsidiary in Asia, on the futures of the crypto market. That was his world, a clear, logical world where everything could be measured and predicted. But his mind wouldn't obey. It kept returning to the absurdity of what he had just witnessed. Legacy. promise. The words floated around like a bug in the code, disrupting his perfect operating system. A man like him, who believed the past was just data to be analyzed to optimize the future, couldn't understand why someone would live or die for it. Their stubbornness didn't just annoy him, it challenged his entire worldview. And Elias Vance never tolerated variables he couldn't control. With a decisive sigh, he picked up the phone. His voice was cold as steel. "Ava, I need you to do something. Find everything on a family in Port Blossom, Oregon. The name is Reyes. Mateo, the father, is deceased. Isabel, the mother. And 2 daughters. I don't know their names. I want their history, connections, weaknesses, debts. Treat this as hostile due diligence. I want a report in 2 hours." While Elias began his investigation, in another part of town, another attack was being orchestrated. In his oak-paneled office at the town hall, Councilman Sterling was pacing, his face a mask of calculation. He was on the phone, his tone full of feigned concern. "Yes, Tim. I'm just worried," he said to a local blogger. "A private jet. A billionaire with a reputation as a vulture like Elias Vance suddenly shows up here, snooping around the old cannery. And then there are those poor Reyes children. They're practically orphans. As a community leader, I have a responsibility to protect them. You know what I mean? Maybe the public should be aware of this shady interest." 2 hours later, an encrypted file appeared on Elias's laptop screen. He opened it. The report was incredibly detailed. He skimmed the first part about Mateo Reyes, a fisherman decorated by the Coast Guard, a local hero lost at sea in a storm 2 years ago. A tragedy, certainly, but to Elias, it was just an emotional obstacle that explained the children's actions. But when he got to the section on Isabel Reyes, he froze. Her employment history revealed a past he hadn't expected. 12 years ago, lead software engineer at Ether Dynamics. The name hit him like a lightning bolt. Ether Dynamics. He remembered it. It was one of the first AI startups he had acquired when he began building his empire. He remembered flying to Seattle to finalize the deal. He remembered chairing a meeting announcing the restructuring, a euphemism for firing almost the entire staff and keeping only the core patents. He didn't remember their faces, of course. To him back then, they were just names on a spreadsheet, expenses to be cut. A faint memory flickered. A young woman with intelligent eyes in the boardroom who had asked a sharp question about the ethics of the algorithm. He had dismissed the question bluntly. Could that have been her? Isabel Reyes? A cold realization ran down Elias's spine. He wasn't an outsider who had stumbled into this family's tragedy. He was one of its architects, more than a decade ago. Just then, his phone buzzed. A notification from the local Port Blossom news app. He clicked on it curiously. The headline hit him, bold, clear, and malicious. Silicon Valley vulture or savior? Billionaire Elias Vance's shady interest in condemned cannery and the orphaned Reyes children. Elias gripped the phone in his hand. He understood immediately. Sterling had struck first. He wasn't just a greedy politician, he was a cunning one. He had turned him into the villain of his own story, using 2 children as pawns to protect his own agenda. This fight was no longer about a piece of land. It had become personal. And Elias Vance, whether he wanted to be or not, was now at the center of the storm. Elias Vance's anger didn't explode like a fire. It was cold as ice, sharp as a razor. He was no amateur to be drawn into public media brawls. He was a chess master, And Councilman Sterling had just made a bold but incredibly foolish move. Sterling had made two fatal mistakes. First, he had underestimated Elias. Second, he had made this personal. Elias didn't call his legal team, nor did he draft a press release in response. That was the way of the weak, of the defensive. Instead, another decision formed in his mind, one that came from instinct rather than calculation. He needed to understand the weapon Sterling was using against him. He needed to see the life of the Reyes children for himself, not through a soulless report, but with his own eyes. He threw on a jacket and stepped out of the hotel, his black SUV silently blending into the drizzling Oregon afternoon. He didn't drive to the factory. Using the information from the report, he found their small house at the end of a quiet street. He parked at a safe distance, close enough to observe without being seen. The small, pale yellow house with its peeling white fence had a small garden that was still defiantly trying to bloom. It looked tired, old, but it was wrapped in an unmistakable feeling of love. It was that simple image, the image of a family trying to hold on, that unwittingly opened a door to a memory Elias had sealed shut for 30 years. The background music shifts to a gentle, somewhat melancholic tone. The scene fades, transitioning to a flashback. He was no longer Elias Vance, the titan of Silicon Valley. He was suddenly just an 8-year-old boy, thin and frail, standing in a cold, sterile social services office. He remembered the smell of disinfectant. He remembered the woman with tired eyes explaining that his mother wasn't coming back. His mother, a single woman who had worked herself to exhaustion at 2 different jobs, had died of a heart attack. And he, young Elias, was now a ward of the state, a file in a cabinet. He remembered the first night at the orphanage, the feeling of being stripped of everything familiar, the strange bed, the rough wool blanket, and the suffocating loneliness amidst other strange children. It was on that night, amidst the quiet sobs of another boy, that 8-year-old Elias made a vow to himself. He would never be this helpless again. He would never depend on anyone's pity. He would build walls of success and money so high that no pain, no person could ever touch him again. He had kept that promise. He had built an empire. But as he looked at that pale yellow house, he realized a horrifying truth. Behind that door weren't 2 strange children. It was a reflection of him, of the 8-year-old Elias who had been left behind. He understood the resolve in Clara's eyes, because he had to have that same resolve. He understood their fight, because he had been fighting that fight his entire life. The front door of the house opened. Clara stepped out first, followed by Rosie. The older girl carefully locked the door, putting the key on a string around her neck. Then she took her little sister's hand. As they walked down the cracked sidewalk, Elias noticed a small detail that said everything. Clara always walked on the outside, placing her small body between Rosie and the street. She wasn't just a sister. She was a protector, a tiny guardian carrying the weight of the world. He was witnessing, in the flesh, the legacy and promise she had spoken of. It wasn't an abstract concept. It was action, responsibility, and unconditional love. Elias sat there, in a car worth more than the house in front of him, and for the first time in decades, the walls he had built began to show cracks. He had come here to find his opponent's weakness, but instead, he had found his own. The anger toward Sterling was still there, but it was now mixed with a new emotion, one he had never allowed himself to feel: protectiveness. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet. But as he watched the two sisters walk hand in hand down the street, he knew one thing for sure. The game had changed, and he would not let Sterling or anyone else use these two children as pawns. Not in his game. The fight for the cannery was no longer about profit or reputation. It had become a fight to save a version of the very past he had tried so hard to bury. The observation from a distance was over. Elias understood that to protect the Reyes children from a wolf like Sterling, he couldn't fight from the shadows. He needed to understand their world, to understand the legacy they revered like a religion. Clara had mentioned a contract, a promise to the school for the blessing of the fleet. That was the thread he needed to pull. A quick call to Ava, and within 10 minutes, he had the information he needed. The person organizing this year's ceremony, the one who had taken on Mateo Reyes's unfinished promise, was an old fisherman named Silas Croft. Silas's address didn't lead to an office, but to a small harborside diner called the Salty Siren. The diner was old, filled with the rich smells of coffee, bacon, and the salty sea air. This was the heart of Old Port Blossom, where fishermen gathered before and after every trip. Elias walked in, his expensive attire looking as out of place as a spaceship landing in a fishing village. All conversation stopped. All eyes turned to him. In a corner booth, an old man with a face weathered by sun and wind and calloused hands was stirring his coffee. That was Silas. Elias approached, but before he could say a word, the fisherman's raspy voice spoke, without even looking up. "If you're here to cause more trouble for the Reyes girls, you can turn right around and walk out. We've read the papers, Mr. Billionaire." This open hostility might have provoked the Elias of yesterday, but the Elias of today was different. He pulled out a chair and sat down, an uninvited but not arrogant gesture. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Elias said, his tone surprisingly direct. "I'm here to understand. I want you to tell me about Mateo Reyes, about those nets, and about why a ceremony is so important that two children would risk their lives for it." Silas finally looked up, his clear blue eyes narrowing, studying him. He saw something different from what the article described. Not greed, but a genuine curiosity, almost a confusion. After a long silence, he sighed. "Mateo wasn't just a fisherman," Silas began, his voice lowering as he spoke of his lost friend. "He was the backbone of this place. When someone's boat was in trouble, Mateo was always the first one out. When a family was short on food, Mateo shared his catch. The blessing of the fleet isn't just a tradition. It's a prayer, a memorial for those lost at sea, and a promise that we will always take care of their families. Those nets Clara and Rosie are mending, they are a symbol of that promise. They are their father's legacy." Silas recounted the story of Mateo's promise, how he had cheerfully agreed to mend the town's torn nets, considering it an honor. He told of how Clara, from a very young age, would always sit beside her father, learning how to tie every knot. "That bastard Sterling," Silas growled. "He's wanted to level this harbor for years. He calls our traditions outdated, an obstacle to progress. He wants to build a slick resort for rich people, a place where people like us aren't even allowed to set foot. He knows this ceremony is the last thread holding this community together. If he can break it, he can break the soul of this town." The old fisherman looked directly into Elias's eyes. "We're just fishermen, Mr. Vance. We know how to fight storms at sea, but we don't have the weapons to fight a man like Sterling. He's got money, power, and a dirty media in his pocket." Elias listened in silence. For the first time, he saw the entire chessboard. This wasn't just his fight, nor was it just the children's. It was the fight of an entire community on the verge of being erased. And in Silas's words, he heard an implicit plea, an admission that this fight required a different kind of weapon, a kind of power that only he possessed. He stood up, placing a $100 bill on the table, not to pay for coffee, but as a sign of respect. "Thank you for sharing, Mr. Croft." As Elias walked out of the diner, the fresh sea air seemed to wash away some of his confusion. He understood. He couldn't win this fight by extinguishing Mateo Reyes's legacy. He had to become its protector. A plan began to form in his mind, not on a spreadsheet of profits, but on something he had never considered an asset, a legacy. And the first step of that plan, ironically, was to do exactly what Clara and Rosie were doing: fulfill their father's promise. Elias Vance didn't waste a second. The moment he left the salty siren, his brain, honed to optimize complex systems, began working with a completely new objective. If Mateo Reyes's legacy was a critical variable, he wouldn't eliminate it. He would optimize it. The first call was to Ava, his resourceful assistant. His voice was clear, decisive, with no room for hesitation. "Ava, I need a top-tier structural engineering team from the West Coast in Port Blossom before midnight. Mission: temporarily secure an old warehouse. It must be absolutely safe for people to work inside for the next 2 weeks. I also need an industrial heating system, generators, and professional-grade lighting installed by 5 a.m. Next, contact every marine supply vendor in the state and find me the best quality needles and twine for net mending. Finally," he paused for a moment, giving the strangest directive, "compile a list of all retired fishermen in Port Blossom who sailed with Mateo Reyes. Invite them to the factory at 7 a.m. tomorrow. Money is no object." The next morning, the Oregon sky was still a blanket of gray. The two sisters, Clara and Rosie, walked their familiar path to the factory, a mix of determination and anxiety in their hearts. Elias's warning about the demolition echoed in Clara's mind. Every day here was a gamble. But as they got closer, something was very different. A soft hum emanated from within, and through the cracks in the steel door, they saw light. Clara's heart tightened. "Sterling," she whispered. He sent his men early. Fear crept in, but she squeezed Rosie's hand, shielding her little sister out of habit. With the caution of a soldier, she nudged the heavy door open and peered inside. And then both children froze, completely overwhelmed. This was no longer the damp, dark and cold warehouse of yesterday. The vast space was illuminated by high-hanging industrial lights, turning every corner into a bright workshop. Giant heaters blew warm air. The floor had been swept clean, and in the center, where their giant pile of nets lay, were now organized workstations. There were sturdy stools, spools of twine in every color neatly arranged, and professional net-mending kits they had only ever dreamed of. In a corner, there was even a long table with thermoses of hot coffee, hot chocolate, and a stack of pastries. But what stunned Clara the most wasn't any of that. It was the people who were there. About a dozen older men, familiar faces from the town, her father's old friends, were sitting quietly on chairs, holding hot cups of coffee, as if waiting for orders. Mr. Silas Croft was there too. He smiled and nodded at the two sisters. What is happening here?" Clara stammered, her defensiveness flaring up. A figure stepped out from behind a large pillar. Elias Vance. He wasn't wearing a business suit, just a black turtleneck and jeans, but his confident and powerful aura was unchanged. "Good morning," he said, his tone casual. "I noticed a few inefficiencies in your workflow." Clara took a step back, pulling Rosie behind her. "What did you do?" This is our job." "It's still your job," Elias replied, stepping closer. He pointed to the newly installed scaffolding and steel support beams. "I've merely ensured the work environment meets occupational safety standards. I've provided the necessary tools to increase productivity. And I've assembled a team of expert consultants." He looked directly into Clara's eyes, and this time his gaze held no annoyance or coldness. "You said this was a promise. I am a man who understands deadlines and resources very well. At your current pace, you cannot finish on time. I am simply optimizing the process so you can keep your promise." He turned to the group of old fishermen. "These men are not here to do the work for you. They are here to show you the knots your father used. They are here to tell stories about him. This legacy is still yours to lead. I am only providing the platform." Silas Croft walked over, placing his calloused but warm hand on Clara's shoulder. "The boy's right, Clara. We're here for Mateo and for you two." Clara looked from Elias's calm face to Silas's kind smile, then to her father's friends. She looked down at the giant pile of nets, a seemingly impossible task. But today, for the first time, it no longer seemed so daunting. The weight on her 11-year-old shoulders felt a little lighter. In the heart of the old, condemned factory, a new community, an unlikely army, had just been formed, ready for a fight they didn't even know they were about to join. In the following days, the old cannery truly came back to life. The initial awkwardness quickly faded, replaced by a vibrant rhythm of work. The space was filled not just with the rustle of twine and the clinking of metal, but with stories. The old fishermen, Mateo's friends, worked while they told the two sisters about their father. They told of stormy voyages, of Mateo's bravery in rescuing a distressed vessel, of his sense of humor and his generous heart. Every knot on the nets seemed to be tied tighter with a memory. Clara, who was used to shouldering everything alone, was undergoing a profound change. At first, she still tried to control everything, watching every stitch the others made with a critical eye. But one afternoon, while struggling with a complex knot her father often used, Silas's weathered hand gently covered hers. "Slow down, little one," he said. "Your father used to say this knot needs patience, not strength." He showed her how to weave the twine, and while doing so, he told a funny story about the time Mateo used that very knot to tie up a giant tuna. Clara listened, and for the first time, she let someone else help her without feeling weak. She was learning to be a leader, not a lone soldier. Elias Vance, meanwhile, kept a certain distance. He set up a desk in a far corner, his laptop always open, his phone calls still worth millions of dollars. But his focus had shifted. Instead of tracking the Shanghai stock market, he was now researching sustainable cooperative models and coastal heritage preservation laws. He was observing a new ecosystem, a machine that ran not on profit, but on trust and a shared purpose. An ecosystem that, ironically, he himself had created. One afternoon, little Rosie shyly approached him, holding out a cookie. "Mr. Silas said you work too much," she said. Elias, used to complex exchanges and multi-page contracts, was a bit flustered by this simple gesture. He gave a stiff nod and took the cookie. Its sweetness felt foreign on his tongue, but it left a strangely warm aftertaste. That peace was suddenly shattered. The main factory door was thrown open, the dim afternoon light blocked by a figure. Councilman Sterling stood there, a smug look on his face, flanked by a nervous-looking building inspector. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Sterling said in a sing-song voice, a smirk on his lips. "A knitting club. I'm afraid I have to inform you that you are all in serious violation of the law." He waved a stack of papers in his hand. "This property is condemned. You are trespassing, Mr. Vance. With all your wealth, I thought you'd have a better understanding of the law. The air in the workshop fell silent. The old fisherman looked at Sterling with contempt. Clara immediately stood in front of Rosie. Sterling continued, his tone condescending. I'd really hate for you esteemed elders to face fines or legal trouble. Please disperse immediately. But before fear could spread, Elias calmly stepped forward. He showed no anger. His face was completely composed, as if discussing the weather. Councilman Sterling, Elias began, his voice even, but carrying an invisible weight. Thank you for your concern for public safety. It is also my top priority. He glanced at the papers in Sterling's hand. My engineering team, from Stratos Structural, a firm I'm sure you've heard of, has conducted a survey and certified this work area as structurally sound for temporary activities. Their report was filed with the city clerk's office this morning, with all necessary permits attached, of course. Sterling started to look flustered. Elias continued, not giving his opponent a second to react. As for trespassing, I am currently in the final stages of acquiring this entire property from its parent corporation. As the prospective owner, I have granted these individuals temporary access, and all are fully insured. Their presence here is entirely legal. He took another step forward, his voice lowering slightly, carrying an unmistakable threat. However, you and this inspector, barging into a site of private commercial negotiation without an official warrant. Now that is a rather interesting legal matter. I'm sure my legal team would be very eager to look into it. Sterling's face went from red to pale. He had come with the law as a threat, but had been broken by the law itself. He was facing an opponent in a completely different league. Without another word, Sterling and the inspector quietly turned and retreated, but the hateful look in his eyes showed that this fight was far from over. As the door closed, the workshop erupted in cheers. The fisherman looked at Elias with a new, deep respect. Clara looked at him, the doubt in her eyes finally gone, replaced by unconcealed admiration. Elias Vance hadn't just given them tools, he had just become their champion. When the factory door closed behind Sterling, the tense silence erupted into cheers and appreciative slaps on the back. They had won an important battle. A strange tech giant hadn't just given them tools, he had stood up as their shield, using the sharp weapons of the elite, the law and power, to protect them. The respect in the fisherman's eyes for Elias was no longer hidden. He wasn't one of them, but he had fought for them. However, after the initial excitement, an even more focused work atmosphere enveloped the workshop. This small victory only made them more aware of the larger fight ahead. They worked with a new urgency, a unity forged through trial. Elias returned to his corner desk, but he could feel the change in the air. He was no longer a suspicious outsider. He had become a part of this place, an unlikely ally. At the end of that day, when everyone had gone home, and only the warm yellow light shone down on the pile of nets, Clara approached Elias. She stood there for a moment, seemingly searching for the right words. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but clear. "Not just for all this, but for being on our side." Elias looked up from his laptop screen. He could have said it was a logical, strategic move, that taking down Sterling was necessary for his long-term goals. But looking into the girl's steady grey eyes, those calculated words seemed false. "Sterling was wrong to underestimate you," was all he said in reply. Clara nodded slightly. "My dad used to say, a person's worth isn't in what they say, but who they choose to stand with when the storm hits." That moment of quiet, near understanding was broken by the ringing of Clara's phone. It was an old phone, and the ringtone sounded shrill in the vast space. She answered, and within seconds, Elias saw all her strength and fortitude vanish. Her face turned white, her eyes wide with panic. "I'll be right there," she cried, her voice breaking. She turned to Elias, the look of a general completely replaced by the terror of an 11-year-old child. "My mom, she's at the clinic. It's getting worse." For a millisecond, the old Elias Vance might have seen this as a complication, an interruption. But the Elias of today only saw a daughter terrified of losing her mother. All calculation vanished. He stood up, the cold decisiveness returning to his voice. But this time, it wasn't to threaten, but to reassure. "Which clinic? What's the address?" he asked rapidly. Clara stammered out the address. Elias immediately pulled out his own phone, dialing an encrypted number. His voice rang out, full of authority and allowing no delay. "Ava, listen. I need you to contact Dr. Aris Thorne at the Oregon Medical Center immediately. Tell him this is a personal directive from Elias Vance. I want a medevac helicopter on the roof of the Port Blossom Community Clinic within the next 60 minutes. Assemble his best oncology team. I don't care what it costs. Make it happen." What happened next was a whirlwind of activity the small town of Port Blossom had never seen. A local ambulance rushed Isabel to the clinic, and just a short while later, the sound of helicopter blades echoed through the sky as a sleek, modern air ambulance landed gently on the rooftop. Townspeople poured into the streets, staring in awe at the sight. Inside the helicopter, the atmosphere was completely different. Clara and Rosie sat in silence, terrified. Elias sat across from them, feeling strangely awkward. He was a master of the boardroom, but here he didn't know how to comfort two grieving children. He just silently handed Rosie a bottle of water and draped a thin blanket over Clara's shoulders. Those small, clumsy actions meant more than any words. Clara looked at the man before her. A few days ago, he was the enemy, the man who wanted to demolish her father's legacy. Now, he was mobilizing an entire elite medical army to save her mother. She didn't understand him. She didn't understand his world. But right now, as the helicopter soared through the gray clouds, taking them to a modern hospital, glittering with lights, she knew that this man, for some reason, had become their only hope. The fight for the cannery seemed to have receded into the background. Now, they were in the middle of a different fight, one far more arduous and important, the fight for a life. And Elias Vance had just bet everything he had on it. The private waiting room at the Oregon Medical Center was another world entirely. It was luxurious, quiet, and terrifyingly sterile. For Elias, this was the first time he felt the limits of his power. He could summon the best medical minds, could pay for the most advanced technology, but he couldn't buy time or command fate. He sat there, motionless, watching the two sisters huddled together on a large sofa. Clara, with all her strength, was now just a trembling little girl, trying to shield her little sister who was sobbing in her arms. For the first time, Elias Vance felt completely helpless. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Aris Thorne walked in. His face was calm, but couldn't hide the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Vance," he began, "Mrs. Reyes's situation is complex. The cancer is in an advanced stage, and it has metastasized. The clinic in Port Blossom didn't have the equipment to diagnose it accurately. That's why her condition deteriorated so quickly." Clara's heart stopped. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, an unconscious gesture. However, Dr. Thorne continued, and there was a flicker of hope in his voice. With the experimental treatments we can access, thanks to your funding, with 24/7 specialized care, we can fight. We can't promise a miracle, but we can give her time, precious time, and importantly, without pain. Time. That was the one thing Elias's money could buy, and right now, it was the most valuable asset in the world. A short while later, a nurse came and said that Isabel wanted to see Elias alone. He entered the intensive care unit, where modern machines beeped steadily, a mechanical symphony sustaining life. Isabel looked weak, pale, but her eyes, Clara's eyes, were still clear and sharp. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice faint. "Not every child in Port Blossom gets a billionaire for a guardian angel." Elias just nodded slightly, not knowing what to say. "You know, don't you?" Isabel asked, looking directly into his eyes. "About Clara." There was no reason to hide it anymore. I suspected," Elias admitted. Isabel smiled, a sad but peaceful smile. "I tried to find you, Elias, after I left Ether Dynamics. But you were like a rocket shooting into the sky. I was just a girl from a small town. I didn't want to be an anchor holding you back. Then I came home, and I met Matteo. He was a good man. He knew everything, and he didn't care. He loved Clara as his own from the very first moment. He was her father, in every way that truly matters." Tears streamed down Isabel's cheeks. "I only ask one thing of you, Elias. Promise me. Promise me they will always be together. Clara needs Rosie, and Rosie needs Clara. And promise me you will tell them about Matteo. Don't let the memory of their wonderful father fade. Let them know how lucky they were to be loved by two fathers." Elias walked to the bedside, taking her thin hand in his. The walls he had built around his heart for 30 years completely crumbled. His voice was hoarse with emotion. "I promise, Isabel. I promise. They will always be together, and they will always know they had two fathers, one who gave them life and one who taught them how to live it." The scene crossfades, then fades back in. Time has passed. 1 year later, Isabel Reyes fought valiantly for another 6 months. 6 priceless, pain-free months, filled with laughter and stories. She had the chance to see the final designs for the project Elias named after her late husband. She passed away peacefully in the arms of her 2 daughters, knowing they would be safe and loved. The old cannery was now unrecognizable. It had become the Matteo Reyes Landing. A bright, bustling space, serving as both a sustainable seafood cooperative for the fishermen and a community center with skills classes and a small memorial for those lost at sea. It had become the beating heart of Port Blossom once more. On a sunny afternoon, Elias, Clara, and Rosie were standing on the new pier. Clara, now looking more like a young teenager, was patiently showing Rosie how to tie a complex fishing knot, the very one Mr. Silas had shown her a year ago. Elias was no longer observing from a distance. He stood right beside them, his arms around both of his daughters' shoulders. He had come to Port Blossom to raise a legacy, but in the end, he was saved by it. He had learned that the greatest success wasn't in building an empire, but in building a family. And as he looked at his 2 daughters, one who carried his blood and one who carried his heart, Elias Vance realized a simple truth. Family isn't something you're born into. Family is something you're brave enough to choose, to fight for, and to build from the broken pieces. And that is the only asset truly worth having.